The winter of 1978 brought something to the plains of South Dakota that folks hadn't seen in nearly half a century. A blizzard so savage, so relentless, that it would bury entire towns under 20-foot drifts and claim lives with the cold indifference of nature at her cruelest. But this story isn't about the storm itself. It's about what one man did when everyone he trusted left him to face it alone. If you're new here, subscribe now because stories like this one don't come around every day. Real survival. Real grit. No Hollywood endings, just the raw truth of what happens when a man refuses to quit. 73-year-old Vernon Mackley had spent his entire life on the family ranch, 300 acres of stubborn grassland that his father had claimed in 1921. Vernon wasn't the kind of man who talked much. His hands did the speaking, calloused and cracked from decades of work that would break younger men in half. He fixed fence posts with baling wire and intuition. He delivered breech calves in the middle of the night with nothing but a kerosene lamp and steady nerves. When the tractor died, he rebuilt the engine with parts scrounged from a junkyard 40 miles away. The following story is presented as a narrative reconstruction. November rolled in cold that year. Vernon felt it in his bones, that particular ache that comes before something terrible. The cattle felt it too, clustering near the windbreaks, their breath forming clouds that hung in the air like warnings. Vernon's two younger brothers, Raymond and Carl, had inherited portions of the neighboring land. They'd modernized, sold off most of their herds, and spent their winters in Arizona now, living off lease payments from farmers who worked their fields. They'd stopped by in early November, pulling up in Raymond's new Lincoln Continental, all warm leather and chrome that seemed obscene against the backdrop of Vernon's weathered barn. "You're a damned fool, Vernon," Raymond had said, stepping carefully to avoid mud on his polished shoes. "Staying out here at your age, one bad winter and you're done." Carl had nodded, always the echo of his older brother. "We've got room in Tucson. Sell this place. Live like a human being for once." Vernon had just looked at them, these men who shared his blood but understood nothing of what kept him rooted to this land. "I'll manage," was all he said. Raymond had laughed, a sound without warmth. "Manage? You can barely manage yourself, old man. What happens when you fall? When your heart gives out, who's gonna find you out here?" They'd left that afternoon, and Vernon watched their taillights disappear down the county road, swallowed by the gray horizon. He didn't know then that it would be the last time he'd see them before the storm hit. The blizzard rolled in on January 9th, 1978. The radio crackled warnings all morning, but Vernon had heard winter warnings before. He'd weathered the storm of 49, the freeze of 62. He knew how to prepare. He brought the cattle in close, broke ice on the water troughs, and stacked hay bales near the barn. But this storm, this monster that descended from the Arctic with winds that screamed like dying things, this was different. By noon, visibility dropped to 0. Snow came horizontal, driven by winds that hit 60, 70 miles per hour. The temperature plummeted to 20 below, then 30, then kept falling. Vernon made it to the barn, fighting wind that tried to rip the door from his hands. Inside, the cattle lowed nervously, sensing something primal and wrong. The main house sat 200 yards from the barn. It might as well have been 200 miles. Vernon tried twice to make the crossing, using a rope he'd strung between buildings years ago for exactly this purpose. Both times, the wind tore him sideways, filling his lungs with snow, turning his world into a white void where direction ceased to exist. The second attempt left him crawling back to the barn on his hands and knees, his face so numb he couldn't feel the blood freezing on his lip where he'd bit through it. He was trapped. The barn offered shelter from the wind, but little else. It was a cavernous space, built in 1923 from hand-hewn timbers and determination. The walls had gaps where the wind whistled through, and the packed dirt floor seemed to radiate cold like it was trying to give it back to the earth. Vernon's house had a furnace, a kitchen, a bed. The barn had none of these things. It had cattle, hay, and tools. It had a workbench his father had built. And it had Vernon, who understood in that moment that he might die here. If you're getting something from this story, drop a comment and let me know. Tell me about a time you had to dig deep and survive something that tested everything you had. These real stories matter, and your experiences matter too. Share them below. The first night Vernon didn't sleep. He couldn't. The cold seeped through his canvas coat through the wool layers beneath, finding his bones with malicious precision. He paced between the cattle, letting their body heat offer brief respite. He did jumping jacks until his knees screamed. He swung his arms and stamped his feet, fighting the seductive whisper of hypothermia that promised rest, promised warmth, promised an end to the struggle. By morning, the storm hadn't weakened. If anything, it had intensified. The radio in his truck, when he could get it to work, spoke of a historic event. Interstates closed, towns cut off, National Guard mobilizing. But the National Guard wasn't coming to Vernon Mackley's barn. Nobody even knew he was there. The cattle were suffering. 2 of the calves had already died, frozen solid near the barn's north wall, where a gap in the boards let the wind slice through. Vernon dragged their bodies outside, fighting the guilt that came with each small corpse. He'd failed them. But if he didn't do something, he'd fail the rest too. And then he'd fail himself. That's when the idea came to him. The barn's south corner, where his father had built a small tack room years ago, offered the most shelter. The space was maybe 10 feet by 12, with walls that extended to the ceiling and a door that actually closed. But it was still just a room in a barn with gaps and cracks and no heat source. Vernon stared at it, his mind working through the problem like he'd worked through 1,000 problems before. He needed shelter within the shelter. He needed insulation. He needed heat. And he needed to build it all with what he had. Vernon's eyes fell on the old implement stored against the far wall, a Quonset hut frame, military surplus from the war, that he'd bought at auction 15 years back with vague plans to build a machine shed. The curved ribs of corrugated metal had sat unused, collecting dust and judgment from his brothers who called it another one of Vernon's white elephants. Now, looking at those curves, Vernon saw salvation. The work began immediately because delay meant death. Vernon's hands shook from cold as he dragged the first metal rib across the barn floor. Each piece weighed close to 40 pounds, and at 73, every muscle in his body protested. But protest didn't matter. Only progress mattered. He positioned the ribs inside the tack room, creating a smaller dome within the walls. The curved metal pieces fit together like a puzzle he solved through trial and error, bolting them with frozen fingers that barely felt the wrench. When one rib slipped and gashed his forearm, Vernon barely noticed. He wrapped it with a rag torn from an old shirt and kept working. Insulation came next. Vernon had bales of straw, purchased cheap from a neighbor who'd had a wet harvest. The bales were considered worthless for feed, too moldy for the cattle. But straw, Vernon knew, trapped air. And trapped air meant insulation. He broke the bales apart with hands that had lost most of their feeling, packing the loose straw between the metal ribs and the tack room walls. He packed it tight, compressing it, creating a barrier against the cold that howled outside. The physical work generated heat, but it also burned energy he couldn't afford to waste. Vernon rationed the granola bars he'd had in his coat pocket, eating half of one every few hours. He melted snow for water using the heat from his own breath, holding handfuls against his chest until they softened enough to suck moisture from. 3 days into the storm, Vernon had the basic structure complete. A curved metal shell maybe 6 feet high at its peak, wrapped in a thick cocoon of straw, tucked into the corner of the tack room like a metallic nest. But the cold still penetrated. The temperature inside his creation hovered barely above 0. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Heat. He needed heat. Vernon surveyed his resources with the calculating eye of a man for whom waste meant death. He had tools. He had wood scraps. He had baling wire and metal sheeting. He had cattle feed and decades of accumulated farm detritus. And he had knowledge. The kind that came from fixing broken things in the middle of nowhere when help was never coming. He built a tiny stove from a 5-gallon metal bucket, cutting ventilation holes with a chisel and hammer, his strikes careful despite the urgency. Every tool use had to be deliberate. Drop a wrench in the snow outside, and it was gone forever. He fashioned a chimney from sections of old irrigation pipe, fitting them together with wire and determination, running the assembly through a gap he created in the metal ribs and out through the barn wall. For fuel, Vernon broke apart wooden pallets and feed crates. He couldn't use hay or straw. Too much smoke, too fast burning. The wood burned slow and gave real heat. He started the first fire with newspaper he'd stuffed in his pockets weeks ago and a lighter that sparked on the 7th try. The warmth, when it came, made him weep. It wasn't much, just a small flame in a converted bucket, but it transformed his metal cocoon from a tomb into something that might actually sustain life. Vernon fed the fire carefully, making each piece of wood count, letting the metal walls radiate heat back into the tiny space. That night, curled in his shelter with the fire crackling, Vernon slept for the first time in 4 days. It was brief, maybe an hour, but it was sleep nonetheless. When he woke, the storm was still raging, but something had changed. He had a chance. The blizzard entered its second week with no sign of mercy. Outside Vernon's tiny metal refuge, the wind continued its relentless assault, piling snow against the barn walls until drifts reached halfway up the structure. The world had become a white void, erasing roads, landmarks, and any hope of rescue. But inside his crude Quonset cabin, Vernon Mackley had created something remarkable, a pocket of survival built from scraps and stubbornness. The cattle were dying. Vernon knew this every time he ventured from his shelter to check on them. Each morning, he'd find another 1 or 2 lying stiff in the straw, their eyes frozen open in final bewilderment. It tore at him, each loss a personal failure. These animals had depended on him, and he couldn't save them, but he couldn't let guilt paralyze him either. The dead cattle, as grim as it seemed, provided something he desperately needed: meat. Vernon had spent his entire life raising cattle, caring for them, doctoring them. The idea of butchering one of his own herd in these circumstances felt like betrayal. But survival didn't care about sentiment. He chose a heifer that had died in the night, dragged the frozen carcass closer to his shelter, and began the brutal work of butchering with a knife he'd sharpened on a whetstone until it could split hairs. His hands, already cracked and bleeding from the cold, grew worse with each cut. The frozen flesh resisted the blade, forcing him to saw rather than slice. Blood froze on his sleeves, on his face, in his beard. It took him the better part of a day to break down enough meat to sustain him. He hung strips inside his shelter, letting them freeze naturally, a macabre larder that would keep him alive. Cooking the meat over his makeshift stove filled the small space with smells that were simultaneously nauseating and life-affirming. Vernon forced himself to eat slowly, to make his stomach accept the richness after days of near starvation. The protein brought strength back to his limbs, clarity to his thoughts. He could think beyond the next hour now. He could plan. The radio, when he could coax it to life, told stories of a region in crisis. Highways remained closed. Towns ran low on fuel and food. People had died, caught in their cars, frozen in their homes when furnaces failed. The National Guard was making supply drops where they could, but the storm's ferocity kept most helicopters grounded. Rural areas were on their own. Vernon thought about his brothers, warm in Arizona, probably reading about this storm in the newspaper over morning coffee. He wondered if they thought about him at all, if it even crossed their minds that their stubborn older brother might be in trouble. Probably not. He'd been written off long ago as the fool who wouldn't leave, the relic too dumb to know when he was beaten. The thought brought a grim smile to his cracked lips. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was a fool. But he was a fool who was still breathing. Improving the shelter became Vernon's focus. The initial construction had been about desperate survival, slapping together anything that might keep him alive another day. Now, with some stability achieved, he could refine his creation. He packed more straw into gaps he'd missed, creating thicker insulation. He fashioned a door from a sheet of plywood, hanging it on improvised hinges made from leather straps. It wasn't pretty, but when closed, it trapped heat with remarkable efficiency. Ventilation presented a constant challenge. The stove consumed oxygen and produced smoke. Too little airflow and he'd suffocate or die from carbon monoxide poisoning. Too much and he'd freeze. Vernon adjusted constantly, opening small gaps, closing others, reading the quality of the air like a text written in smoke and breath. His decades of experience with machinery, with understanding how systems worked, saved his life a dozen times over as he balanced these competing needs. Water remained a critical concern. He couldn't venture outside to gather clean snow. The storm made that impossible. Instead, he melted snow that blew in through cracks in the barn walls, collecting it in buckets and pans. The water tasted of dirt and hay, but it was wet, and that's what mattered. He boiled it when he could spare the fuel, more for warmth than purification. The isolation began to press on Vernon's mind in ways the physical hardship didn't. He'd always been comfortable with solitude, preferring the company of cattle and wind to people. But this was different. This was complete severance from the human world. A Robinson Crusoe existence without even the hope of a Friday. He talked to himself, narrating his actions like a play-by-play announcer. He sang songs he'd learned as a boy, his voice cracking in the cold air. Anything to hear human sound, even if it was just his own. On the 12th day, something changed in the storm. The wind, which had blown with consistent violence, began to gust erratically. Periods of relative calm would stretch for an hour, then the wind would return with renewed fury. Vernon recognized this pattern. The blizzard was dying, entering its final throes. Hope, dangerous and seductive, crept into his chest. He decided to risk a scouting mission to the house. The rope he'd strung between buildings was buried under feet of snow, but Vernon knew where it ran. He fashioned a longer tether from baling twine, tying one end to the barn door and the other around his waist. If he got disoriented, the rope would lead him back. It was the same principle that had saved countless explorers and a few smart farmers. The journey of 200 yards took over an hour. Vernon moved in a crouch, feeling his way forward, testing each step before committing his weight. The snow had drifted in bizarre formations, creating valleys and peaks that bore no relation to the flat ground he knew. Twice he fell into hidden depressions, floundering in powder that swallowed him to his chest. Each time, panic fluttered in his throat before training and discipline forced calm. He'd extract himself carefully, methodically, refusing to waste energy on fear. The house, when he finally reached it, looked like a monument to winter's power. Snow had blown in through a window that had shattered from the pressure, filling the living room with a drift that reached the ceiling. The temperature inside was no different from outside. Everything was frozen solid. Pipes burst, furniture encased in ice. But the basement, accessed through an exterior bulkhead door that Vernon had to dig out by hand, offered treasures. Canned goods lined shelves his wife had stocked before she passed 8 years ago. Green beans, tomatoes, peaches and syrup. Vernon loaded his pockets and a burlap sack he'd brought, taking as much as he could carry. He also grabbed a wool blanket from the linen closet, shaking ice crystals from its folds. The return trip, burdened with supplies, tested Vernon's endurance to its limit. The rope guided him true, but the weight made every step a negotiation with muscles that threatened to quit. He rested 4 times sitting in the snow, knowing that each rest made the next movement harder but unable to continue without pause. When he finally stumbled back into the barn, then into his shelter, Vernon collapsed next to his little stove and didn't move for an hour. But he'd succeeded. He had food now, real food. The canned peaches, eaten cold and thick with syrup, tasted like victory. The storm finally broke on day 14. Vernon woke to silence, an absence of sound so profound it felt like a presence. The wind had stopped. He crawled from his shelter, through the tack room, and pushed open the barn door. The world had been remade in white. Snow stretched in every direction, sculpted by wind into waves and ridges that looked more like an ocean frozen mid-swell than a South Dakota prairie. The sky, visible for the first time in 2 weeks, stretched overhead in a blue so deep and clear it hurt to look at. Vernon stood in the barn doorway, a scarecrow figure wrapped in layers of filthy clothes, his beard matted with ice and blood and God knows what else. He looked at what the storm had wrought, and he laughed. It was a sound somewhere between triumph and hysteria, echoing across the frozen landscape. He'd survived. Against odds that should have killed him, using nothing but what his hands could build and his mind could devise, He'd survived. But survival was just the beginning. Now came the aftermath. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away across impassable drifts. The phone lines were down. He'd verified that during his trip to the house. Vernon had no way to call for help, no way to let anyone know he was alive. He could wait for rescue, but how long would that take? Days? Weeks? And what would he do in the meantime? The cattle that remained needed care. The shelter that had saved him needed maintenance. Life, even in diminished form, made demands. Vernon decided to walk out. It was an insane idea, the kind of decision that would make reasonable people question his sanity. 5 miles through snow drifts that reached 10-15 feet in places. At 73 years old, already weakened by 2 weeks of privation. With no guarantee anyone would be at the neighbor's place or that he'd even find it under the transformed landscape. But Vernon Mackley had never been accused of being reasonable. He prepared for 2 days, building up his strength with the canned goods and meat. He fashioned snowshoes from scrap wood and baling twine, crude things that looked like they'd fall apart before he made it a mile. He packed a small bundle of supplies, dried meat and canned peaches wrapped in the wool blanket. He left food and water for the surviving cattle, knowing it probably wouldn't be enough, but doing what he could. On the morning of day 17 after the storm's beginning, Vernon locked the barn, more from habit than any belief that locks mattered anymore, and started walking. The journey became a fever dream of white and cold and pain. The snowshoes helped, distributing his weight enough that he only sank a foot or two with each step instead of disappearing entirely. But each step still required enormous effort, lifting his leg high, placing it forward, shifting his weight, then repeating with the other leg. Again and again and again. He navigated by landmarks he could barely recognize. That bump might be the hill where the old windmill stood. That depression could be the creek bed. Or everything might be wrong, the snow disguising the land so completely that he was walking in circles. Vernon pushed the doubt away and kept moving. Midday, he fell into a drift that collapsed beneath him, plunging him into a void between the snow and a buried fence. He flailed in the powder, the claustrophobia of being buried alive sending his heart racing. His hand found the fence post, solid and real, and he used it to pull himself free, emerging like a birth into the blinding white world. He rested then, sitting on the compressed snow of his own pit, eating a peach from a can he had to chip ice from. The sweetness exploded on his tongue, and for a moment Vernon was young again, sitting on his mother's porch in summer eating peaches she'd canned, juice running down his chin while she smiled and called him her messy boy. The memory gave him strength to stand, to continue. The sun was dropping toward the horizon when Vernon saw smoke, a thin gray line rising from a point perhaps a mile ahead, barely visible against the white landscape but unmistakable to eyes that had spent 2 weeks seeing nothing but snow and barn walls. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. Fire meant he might actually survive this walk that had consumed every reserve of strength he possessed. His snowshoes had broken an hour earlier, the crude bindings finally surrendering to the constant stress. Vernon had continued without them, each step now plunging him thigh-deep into the snow, forcing him to essentially swim through the drifts. His breathing came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering against ribs that showed through skin gone slack from weight loss, but the smoke pulled him forward like a beacon. The house emerged from the white gradually, the Henderson's place, he realized with relief flooding through him. Dale and Martha Henderson, good people who'd lived here for 30 years. Their farmhouse sat partially buried, drifts reaching the second-story windows on the north side, but smoke rose steadily from the chimney. Vernon tried to call out, but his voice emerged as a croak, barely audible even to himself. He pushed forward, using fence posts to pull himself along. 50 yards, 40, 30. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, everything going gray except for that house. He made it to the porch and collapsed. His last conscious act was pounding on the door with a fist that felt like it belonged to someone else. 3 weak thumps that wouldn't wake a light sleeper. Vernon woke in warmth. Real warmth, not the grudging heat of his bucket stove, but the enveloping embrace of a properly heated room. He was in a bed with clean sheets and wool blankets piled high. An IV ran into his arm. Easy there, Mr. Mackley. Martha Henderson appeared in his vision, her face drawn with worry. You're safe. You're at our place. Dale found you on the porch yesterday evening. We thought you were dead. Yesterday evening. Vernon's mind struggled to process this. He'd lost time, hours swallowed by unconsciousness. My barn, he managed to croak. Cattle. Martha's expression told him what he needed to know. Dale tried to get over there this morning on the snowmobile. The drifts are too high. Vernon, nobody thought you were out there. Your brothers told everyone you'd gone to stay with a friend in Pierre before the storm hit. The words hit Vernon like a physical blow. His brothers had simply decided he must have left, had told people that's what happened, probably believing it themselves. They'd written him off, erased him from their concern with a convenient fiction. I was there, Vernon said, his voice gaining strength from anger. Whole time, built a shelter, in the barn. Martha's eyes widened. You survived 2 weeks in your barn? Vernon, how? The temperature hit 40 below. People died in their homes with furnaces running. Over the next hour, as Martha brought him broth and bread, Vernon told his story. He spoke of the Quonset ribs and the straw insulation, the bucket stove and the improvised chimney. He described the frozen cattle and the grim necessity of butchering for meat. He explained his ventilation system, the constant balance between warmth and breathable air. Martha listened with an expression that cycled between horror and amazement. When he finished, she shook her head. Vernon Mackley, you're the most stubbornly resourceful man I've ever known. Most people would have died the first night. Just did what needed doing, Vernon said. Dale Henderson came in then, a burly man whose face showed the strain of the past weeks. He's awake? Thank God. Vernon found you on the porch looking like a frozen corpse. Your lips were blue. Appreciate you taking me in, Vernon said. Already called emergency services on the radio, Dale said. They've got a military vehicle headed to your place right now. They'll do what they can for any livestock still alive. Vernon wanted to protest, but exhaustion pulled at him. Sleep took him mid-sentence. He drifted in and out over the next days, fighting a fever from infection in his frostbitten fingers. Antibiotics fought the infection while his body worked to heal. 3 fingers on his left hand would never fully bend again. Toes on both feet had suffered severe frostbite. But he'd keep them, the doctor said. Another day exposed and the outcome would have been different. A week after his collapse, Vernon was finally strong enough to sit up. The Hendersons had a television and it showed coverage of the blizzard's aftermath. The storm had killed dozens. Livestock losses numbered in the hundreds of thousands. And then Vernon saw himself. The news crew had made it to his farm, filming the barn and the devastation. The camera moved inside to the tack room and focused on Vernon's creation. The tiny Quonset shelter sat there, impossibly crude and impossibly brilliant. The curved metal ribs wrapped in straw insulation, the plywood door on leather hinges, the bucket stove with its improvised chimney. The reporter's voice carried disbelief. This structure, assembled entirely from materials found in the barn, sustained temperatures inside of approximately 30 to 40 degrees, even as outside temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. The design demonstrates principles engineers are calling remarkably sophisticated. The camera zoomed in on details. The layered straw insulation, the ventilation system, the efficient use of space. Vernon Mackley, 73 years old, spent 17 days in this shelter, alone, presumed by his own family to have evacuated. What he built here likely saved his life. Martha came to sit beside him. You've become famous. News crews calling nonstop. Engineering professors want to study what you built. Vernon grunted, uncomfortable with attention. Just did what needed doing. 3 weeks after his rescue, Raymond and Carl showed up. They arrived in Carl's truck from the airport. Both men looked uncomfortable, their expensive coats marking them as outsiders. Martha showed them to where Vernon sat by the window. The brothers stood in the doorway. Finally, Raymond spoke. Vernon, we didn't know. We thought you'd left. We told people you were in Pierre. But I didn't, Vernon said flatly. Stayed right where I've always been. Carl stepped forward. We saw the news. Saw what you built. We should have checked on you. Should have known better. You should have, Vernon agreed. You laughed at me for buying those Quonset ribs. Called it junk. Called me a fool. Raymond's face reddened. We were wrong. About the ribs, about you, about everything. That junk saved your life. And we mocked you for it. You dismissed me, Vernon said quietly. Treated me like I was losing my mind. You wrote me off as too stubborn to know when I was beaten. Carl sat heavily. You're right. We saw an old man doing things the hard way, and we judged you. We forgot that knowing how to work with your hands has real value. That useless junk kept me alive, Vernon said. While you two were warm in Arizona, I was building something engineers are calling sophisticated. Silence stretched. Finally, Raymond spoke, his voice rough. We came to apologize, and to help. Whatever you need to rebuild, we're here. Don't want charity. Not charity, Carl said. Family helping family. Us trying to make right what we got wrong. Vernon studied his brothers. Part of him wanted to refuse. But the practical part recognized the ranch needed help. All right, he said finally, but I'm running things my way. Help is welcome. Telling me what to do isn't. Both brothers nodded, relief visible. They talked then, carefully at first, then more freely. About the storm, the shelter, what came next. The conversation was honest in a way it hadn't been for years. Vernon described the worst moments, the fear, the cold, the calculations between survival and death. His brothers listened, and Vernon saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine respect. The ranch recovered slowly. With his brother's help and neighbors pitching in, Vernon rebuilt. New cattle arrived in spring. Repairs were made. But Vernon kept the shelter exactly as it was, preserved in the tack room corner. Visitors came sometimes to see the structure that had saved a man's life. Vernon would show them, explaining each decision without embellishment, just a man who'd refused to quit. The shelter stood as testament to a simple truth Vernon had lived by, that resourcefulness, knowledge, and refusal to surrender could overcome even nature's cruelest tests. And that sometimes, the things others dismiss as worthless are exactly what save your life when it matters most.